We're going back to a world tonight where sin isn't just an error. It's your birthright, your body, a battlefield, your passions, the devil's whispers, and the greatest danger to your soul. That warm, perplexing tingle behind your belt could be the cause. The church doesn't simply disapprove of your sleeping habits in the Middle Ages. It surrounds them with a whole system of shame, terror, and damnation, and it's likely that you won't make it through this. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Add the current time and your city in the comments as well. Who is listening to this at 3 in the morning? Thoughts of medieval dread while lying flat. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. The world already believes you are corrupt when you are born. It is around the year 1237, and you're already in spiritual debt from the minute the frigid air fills your lungs in that dirt-packed hut or icy church. Why? Due to an incident that occurred in a garden thousands of years ago involving 2 legendary nudists. Yes, exactly. Because Adam and Eve had the gall to eat a knowledge fruit and then look at each other's body parts, your soul is tarnished. Everything you will learn about sex is based on this concept known as original sin. And there will be a lot, I assure you. You've already been called a little sinner by the time you're old enough to inquire about the origins of newborns. Nor is the church subtle about it. It's a race against the clock during baptism. A baby's soul is unlikely to go to heaven if they pass away without being baptized. Early on, the fear begins. Salvation is conditional, and death is never far away. You will comprehend the fear that follows birth, even if you don't understand why it's such a problem. This unsettling notion that desire is harmful and the body is dirty is at its core. Sex is more than just physical contact. It's a minefield of spirituality. During Mass, you have most likely previously heard some spooky Latin. Words like concupiscentia, which sounds like a demon dictionary spell but actually means lust. It's spoken in a tone similar to that of a sickness. It is, in a sense. The church holds that lust corrupts your soul, causes you to drift away from God, and leads to eternal damnation. So, enjoy going through puberty. Naturally, these concepts don't appear out of thin air. Much of this can be attributed to St. Augustine, one of the founding thinkers of Western Christianity. Augustine swung strongly the other way after a tumultuous youth that, incidentally, included a mistress, an unmarried child, and a quote-unquote prayer that ran, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." He became one of the most influential voices of sexual paranoia in church history as a result of his spiritual transformation. After the fall, sex was always associated with guilt for Augustine, including baby-making sex and marital sex. If it was pleasant, it was polluted. This is where things start to get strange. The religion begins to dismiss pleasure as a coincidence. For example, it's possible that having sex is necessary in order to conceive, but it's suspect if you like it. The purpose is not the pleasure. It's the adverse consequence. Therefore, you ought to feel embarrassed about it. You have been indoctrinated to this message since you were a young child. Priests emphasize it in their sermons. You can see the horrifying results in artwork. And all of your sins are recorded in your permanent credit report. Everyone's is maxed out. Spoiler alert. A fringe idea that even infants may exhibit some form of wicked pleasure is even stranger. It may sound ridiculous, but medieval theologians took their work quite seriously. Some of them hypothesized that a corrupted nature could be indicated by an infant's wriggle or coo. Eden left behind that severe interior decay. Back then, innocence as we understand it today wasn't actually a thing. It wasn't a pristine childhood. The church made sure that fear was ingrained early because it was precarious. Now, don't misunderstand. Not everyone was constantly wandering around in fear. Individuals remained human. They had affairs, joked around, and flirted. The hypocrisy made even the dog laugh. The voice of the church, however, was everywhere. feast days and fast days, saints to worship and sins to confess, and an unseen force that accompanied you to your deathbed, whispering that your flesh was your enemy, were all part of the laws, the art, and the very rhythm of your days. Naturally, there was no one-size-fits-all approach to this. Behind the cathedral doors, there were contentious discussions. Some theologians attempted to make the case that if one approached it with the proper attitude, having sex while married was not sinful. Others stepped forward, stating that even married couples should make every effort to abstain. The extent to which these teachings were successful or widely accepted is still up for debate. After playing in the hayloft, was the typical medieval villager shaking with guilt? Or were they merely attempting to produce offspring and stay warm? Hard to say. We do know that the fuel was fear. Dread of excommunication, dread of shame, and fear of hell. Every bedroom didn't need to be patrolled by the church. All it had to do was give you the impression that it might. After all, internalized terror is a fairly reliable surveillance mechanism. Furthermore, the last thing you want is to mess with God in a world when disease, conflict, and starvation are ever-present threats. You learn to keep silent as a result. Before you experience desire, you learn to experience guilt. You bury desire in your mental prison and hope no one notices when it occurs, which is always the case. Because fire and brimstone isn't the true retribution in the end. Is your inner voice telling you that you're already lost? Suppose that you survived to adolescence without exploding with remorse. You're lucky, but now that you're noticing things are going to get a lot stranger. You know how the touch of someone's sleeve warms your skin? Or how the baker's daughter laughs a bit too loudly when you walk by? Isn't that normal? Even natural? The Middle Ages? No, not at all. Chemistry isn't like that. It's sabotage of the spirit. And this is the point at which the worry of one man becomes the burden of all. For his encore performance, St. Augustine is back. Augustine was more than just a powerful figure. When it comes to early Christian conceptions of desire, he was the man. His entire ideology was based on the idea that sexual passion was harmful, particularly because it appeared to overpower rationality. That was what he was afraid of most. The soul objected to what the body was doing. He believed that humans were in complete control. Like turning a switch, Adam was said to be able to choose when to become aroused. All bets were off, though, following that prohibited fruit bite. The body resisted. Desire started to rebel. He was frightened by that. What was the church's response to that fear, then? It made it official. It demonstrated that lust was more than just an emotion. It was an ethical transgression, corruption that might result in damnation for all eternity. And lust was sticky, unlike a fleeting bad mood or a fit of rage. It persisted. Dreams were invaded, whispering from the shadows and nestled inside every curve of the body. It appeared in the world's very architecture. You were more than just lustful. You had lust. By design, which required ongoing attention to detail. From the pulpit, you hear this. Priests, of course, use nearly exact quotes from Augustine. Love is not lust. Disorder is want. It goes beyond Sunday preaching, though. It's also present in the artwork. Stories of visual horror abound in medieval churches. Cathedral door carvings depict nude people writhing in hellfire. Demon beings with these very curiously formed tails are usually chasing, whipping, or devouring someone. These metaphors aren't abstract, they are cautions. Torment results from lust. Furthermore, anguish is not merely hypothetical, it's frozen in stone, right there. Then there are the mystery plays, which are regional productions that aim to impart Christian values. They weren't subtle. In one, a character dressed like a medieval sex icon strides on the stage portraying lust before a demon with a huge tongue drags him screaming into hell. With more fire and a larger budget for fake blood, these shows were the medieval equivalent of after-school specials. As you watched, You chuckled uneasily and recalled that boners are the ones who pave the way to hell. Poetry joined in as well. Lines on temptation would be interspersed with religious phrases, perhaps a widow who is too eager to get married again, or a knight who is too captivated by a maiden's attractiveness. And the objective was never those lines. They served as a warning. Indeed, love could exist, but only in a specific pre-approved form. Anything beyond that, any trace of passion or unbridled desire, was not just dangerous, but lethal. Here's something strange now. Like sickness, desire was physically communicated according to medieval thought. According to one belief, a man's passion might contaminate a woman just by looking at her. Even if she didn't want it, if he gave her the wrong look, it might cause her to think immoral things. Making eye contact become morally right. This is the reason why so many religious women, nuns in particular, were urged to cover their faces and turn away from others, not out of shyness, but rather for protection. The masculine gaze was spiritually toxic in addition to being bothersome, and when it came to women, the fear associated with lust doubled. The Church enthusiastically expanded the tone that Augustine may have established. After all, it was Eve who first tempted Adam. The story proceeded like that. Consequently, it was believed that all women were morally inferior, more prone to temptation, and more likely to initiate it. You were taught that your body was a trap since you were a medieval woman. Your hair is poisonous, and your voice is a temptation. Take a moment to process that. Someone could go to hell because of your hair. Even shaving their heads was a sign of complete resignation for some nuns. Naturally, not everyone agreed with all of this. Some academics believed that the human body might not be entirely malevolent. Some even maintained that desire within a marriage didn't have to be humiliating, and that marital love was a precious thing. They had to exercise caution, though, because those voices were softer. Anything that seemed excessively lenient towards sin ran the risk of being tried for heresy. To put it another way, the Inquisition was against second chances. When you include the memory problem, the topic becomes even more complicated. What if you did not repeat a lustful deed that you remembered? Was the remembrance itself sinful? Could a dream, a thought, or a persistent mental image from 5 years ago doom you? Many church leaders agreed. Confession became a spiritual tightrope walk as a result. With your eyes downcast, you would sit across from a priest and attempt to convey how bad you felt for considering your neighbor's shoulders while you were praying. It's rather ridiculous and tragic at the same time. Here, a more profound pattern becomes apparent. Fear served more purposes than preserving morality. The goal was to maintain control over them. People would self-police like experts if you could make them believe that their ideas alone could condemn them to damnation. To enforce morals, you didn't need an army. All you needed was enough ingrained fear to keep people scared of themselves. The wildest portion comes next. A lot of folks actually thought it worked. They saw the terror as evidence of their faith. You obviously didn't understand God if you weren't afraid of your own body. To keep ahead of the fires, a good Christian was always a little nervous, always a bit guilty, and always one heartbeat away from revealing anything. Here you are, youthful, hormonally laden, perplexed, and completely persuaded that your body is a spiritual minefield. You wish to be decent? Indeed you do. You have eyes, though. You feel things too. You have dreams. You're daydreaming. You feel a little astonished when you unintentionally touch someone. And a tiny voice murmurs that this is precisely how souls are lost every time it occurs. Nor in conflict, nor in criminal activity, but in blushing, looking, and longing. The actual battlefield is there. The church isn't going to relax, to give you a hint. You now carry this unseen burden with you everywhere you go. Your thoughts could be worse. Your body a liability. Want is sin, and desire is peril. But you know what aggravates me the most? It all comes down to two individuals, a fruit tree and a snake. The entire medieval sex horror is suspended from a single story, and the fall of man is that story. As a child, you may have heard the story of Adam and Eve playing in the Garden of Eden, completely innocent until Eve chooses the incorrect snack. However, this was more than just a myth during the Middle Ages. The scene of the crime was moral, and you're still serving the sentence thousands of years later. This served as the cornerstone around which the church based its entire sexual shame teaching. Eve's innocence was destroyed the instant she bit the fruit. Not only for Adam, not only for her, but for everyone. Sin was brought into the world by this deed. Not just any sin either. It was the first sin, the one that caused such a deep rift in human nature that even infants were at risk. You guessed it. Sexual desire is the most obvious indication of that harm. The first thing Adam and Eve did after the fall, according to medieval theology, was to recognize their nudity and feel humiliated. It was evidence that desire had corrupted both you and them when you suddenly became aware of the body's strength and attraction. Let's not overlook the undertone here either. Eve was the first to sin. Adam did in fact follow her example, but the church made it quite evident who was at fault. Women were viewed as more visually alluring, morally brittle, and spiritually weaker. Therefore, women were the initial delivery channel for original sin, even if it affected everyone. Centuries of worry about female sexuality grew out of that small theological aside. Women were the weapon that gave lust to males who were susceptible to it. The fact that medieval authors enjoyed relying on this cliché doesn't help. Women were characterized as seductresses, sirens, and distractions from holiness in both popular fiction and scriptural commentary. A monk claims in one passage that women are Satan's snare. In another, a bishop claims that a man could commit deadly sin only by gazing at a lady. That was the depth of the fear. A look, a smell, a chuckle. It was never merely a passing fancy. A full-scale spiritual ambush took place. You ask, what about marriage? There must have been a place where people could express their love and desire without fear of repercussions. Sort of. Although sex within marriage was permitted by the church, it was nonetheless strictly regulated and fraught with caution. Procreation was the sole purpose of sex. The aim was never pleasure. It's okay if you end up enjoying it. However, you'd better regret it afterwards. In certain cases, married couples were even urged to abstain. Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, and Communion, during menstruation, following childbirth. There weren't many days left on the calendar, depending on how strictly you adhered to the guidelines. Nevertheless, many continued to get married in spite of all the pressure. Nevertheless, they fell in love. They continued to have sex. Given the size of medieval families, a lot of it. Here's the main distinction, though. Anxiety accompanied every action. You weren't truly safe, not even in the most revered, church-approved kind of intercourse. Guilt was still a problem for you. Confession was still required, and you still needed to persuade your priest and yourself that you weren't having too much fun. This debate is fascinating. According to some academics, the concept of original sin did not, in fact, increase people's feelings of guilt. It provided them with a means of elucidating their initial struggles. Your dirty ideas weren't your fault. You were born with it. Original sin turned into a strange kind of solace in this context. Like, I obviously made a mistake. I'm a human. Although that may be the case, the consolation is short-lived, because being human still entails ongoing risk. The church didn't want your flaws to make you feel too good. It was good to feel a bit guilty. A great deal of guilt was preferable. Oh, how the church fulfilled that promise. It was impossible to avoid the visuals. Any cathedral you enter is filled with suffering, snakes, and fire. The naked and weeping Adam and Eve, the sword-wielding angels, the clawed devils, and, most importantly, the silent, bleeding Christ on the cross serve as a reminder of the price of sin. That picture wasn't merely ornamental. It was a stony stone carving of theology. There were repercussions for your desire. Your language also altered as a result of it. There were many words like temptation, defilement, and virginity in the language of love. Once beautiful or passionate words were transformed into something harmful. There wasn't much space for nuance in the church's lexicon. Either love was sacred or it wasn't. And you know what? It most likely wasn't if it impacted your body. This is an interesting side fact. Before the autumn, several medieval theologians attempted to understand what sex was like. They pictured Adam and Eve engaging in sexual activity without lust, as if it were a sanitized form of closeness. No clumsy stumbling, no desire, just courteous, divinely sanctioned reproduction that is completely logical and impersonal. That was the ideal. Can you believe that? The church hoped you would aim towards that. Sexual encounters that resembled academic exchanges. All of this lofty theology, however, doesn't alter the fact that you're still living in your medieval village. You're still feeling things. You still become sidetracked. You continue to gaze too long. And now, because of the church's fixation on Eden, every time your heart beats a bit quicker, you get a shock of guilt. Because whenever you feel a spark, you can't help but feel like you're reenacting the fall in some way, no matter how hard you try. Because of this, the humiliation, the quiet, and the fear are reinforced in confessions. Echoed in sermons, painted on walls, and passed down from parent to kid generation after generation without anybody truly questioning it. Not quite yet, because religion is no longer the only factor in this. It has to do with identity. To be human is to be fallen. Your corruption is demonstrated by your desire. And that awareness remains with you like a persistent, low aching behind your ribs until the end of the world or the return of Christ. You bear the consequences even though you weren't present when Eve chewed the fruit. Your inheritance is every day, every desire, and every time you look at someone and sense something stirring. Shame, not wisdom, not gold. Imagine that you live to adulthood, were already considered a miracle during the Middle Ages, and somehow escaped being labeled a heretic, being ensnared in a conflict, or succumbing to the disease. You've spent your entire life hearing about sin. You've murmured shamefully in confessionals, sat through sermons that made you writhe, and wrestled with dreams that left you feeling like a Praille's swamp on more nights than you'd like to admit. Perhaps you're married, or in the process of getting married, and you're wondering if this is the point at which things will finally improve. It's not because marriage wasn't a celebration of passion and love in the medieval church. Spoiler alert. Damage control was the goal. To be clear, sex was not prohibited in and of itself. It was not even a choice. In order to grow the economy, raise new Christians, fill the pews, and breed, the church needed people. It did not, however, enjoy having intercourse. As a reluctant acknowledgement of human frailty, the church actually viewed it as a necessary evil. The institution that contained desire in a small, restrictive box was marriage. And there would be lifelong repercussions if you colored outside of those lines. Let's say you recently got married. An added perk is that you might genuinely like your spouse. Because weddings are frequently arranged, more for alliances, dowries, and land than for love. You make a vow to stay true in front of a priest, and you might even give your partner a small smile. This is a time of hope. However, there is an implicit warning hidden underneath all of that pomp. Don't get ahead of yourself. 3 marriage-related commodities were formally listed by the medieval church: loyalty, procreation, and a kind of controlled, regulated release of lust. You might engage in sexual activity. The person you are doing it with might even be someone you like. However, pleasure in and of itself was a slippery slope. Sex was only considered sinless within the sanctity of marriage if it was performed with the proper attitude, which meant that it had to be for babies and not for fun. In reality, how did people handle that? Uncomfortably, there were handbooks with surprisingly thorough instructions for confessors, priests who listened to your misdeeds. These manuals included every conceivable sexual act, goal, and situation in an attempt to assess the severity of your transgression. During Lent, did you have sex? Sin. Despite being married, did you just do it because you wanted to? Is it still sinful? Did you go above and beyond? Greater sin? The list of offenses was lengthy, and the bedroom had been converted into a courtroom by the church. Even the idea of a marital debt exists. Although it sounds like a medieval credit issue, obligation is the true issue. Unless you were both fasting, menstruating, pregnant, recuperating from childbirth, or in mourning, you had to give your husband sex if they requested it. Here's the twist, though. You may still accrue sin points if you had sex purely for the sake of fulfilling that commitment. In essence, you are unable to succeed because of a spiritual gap. Celibacy, on the other hand, was the highest sexual ideal. Instead of marriage, but not in it. Complete abstinence was the most sacred route. Priests, monks, and nuns were therefore highly respected. They completely abstained from having sex. In their quest for holy purity, they sacrificed marriage, family, and all their natural desires. They created an unachievable bar for everyone else in the process. When possible, married people were urged to emulate the celibacy lifestyle. It was similar to receiving accolades for having a job, but being informed repeatedly that it would be more holy to quit your job completely. As a result, virginity, particularly female virginity, became a societal fixation. Chastity was more than just a personal virtue for women. Social currency was what it was. Virgins were valued not only for their innocence, but also for the fact that they had not yet fallen. They were thought to be more like Eve than the apple. Brides were inspected. There were rumors of luminous auras, miraculous signs, and paranormal visions that attested to a woman's unspoiled status. And good luck after that status was removed. Yes, you might be pardoned, but you would never be admired. It gets stranger from here. Some theologians maintain that by refraining from having sex after marriage, married couples could reach a higher spiritual state. The gold standard was referred to as spiritual marriage, or complete voluntary abstinence. According to reports, a few couples consented to this, sharing a residence but sleeping in different beds, deciding on salvation above closeness. Was this typical? Not at all. Was it hailed as the best? Totally. It was an obvious message. Even if you were legally allowed to use the body, true holiness meant rejecting it. There are plenty of contradictions, of course. Consider the tale of Saint Cecilia, a well-known character from medieval mythology. She warned her husband on their wedding night that if he touched her, an angel would kill him. That was meant to symbolize both his ultimate spiritual awakening and her innocence. Isn't it romantic? In essence, it says, "I love you, but if you get naked, you'll die." This story was presented as motivational. The extent to which these beliefs were prevalent among the general public is still up for debate among academics. Bishops and theologians wrote a great deal about purity and passion, but did the typical peasant couple with 7 children and a one-room hut really spend time worrying about whether or not last Tuesday's sex was for the sake of procreation? Perhaps not. However, the structure was always present. Desire was never safe in the moral environment that the church fostered. The specter of those lessons hovered over you like smoke, even if you weren't actively abiding by all the rules. And the terror didn't end at the door of the bedroom. It followed you into your own thoughts, into church, and into your worries. Because there were repercussions if you were discovered or even suspected of departing from the authorized script. Excommunication, humiliation, fines, public penance, and, most importantly, the worry that God was observing. Never stops observing. The internalized fear's beauty lies in that. You become your own prison guard as a result. It is important to remember that not everyone passively embraced this system. Poets, lovers, and even a few dissident priests attempted to define a more humane definition of love in these pockets of resistance. But the brimstone and fire frequently muffled such voices. Furthermore, people rarely completely avoided the guilt, even when they did revolt. Too much effort had gone into sowing and nurturing the fear. Even though you are married and legitimate, you are still afraid that your desire is a spiritual bomb. You follow the calendar, say the proper prayers, do what is asked of you, confess frequently, and try not to get too caught up in the good times. Because pleasure is always only a hair's breadth away from punishment in the medieval imagination. Furthermore, love is sacred. Yes, but only if it never turns around and only follows the smallest of paths. Let's discuss your aspirations. Not the noble, virtuous kind, where you dream of mastering the lute or creating a better life. We're referring to the other type, the late-night, hot, gloomy kind that intrudes like an unwanted visitor into your slumber. You couldn't even leave the church while unconscious in the Middle Ages. Because congratulations if you wake up feeling a little flushed, breathless, or sweaty. Most likely, you've just dealt with demons. Yes, that is a reality. Greetings from the incredibly strange religion of demonic desire. Imagine this then. You're a devout man making a concerted effort to follow the straight and narrow. You avoid making eye contact with the milkmaid. You fast, you pray, and you confess. Even when you're doing everything correctly, your brain fails you one night. Temptation is what you dream about. You're sweating, bewildered, and let's face it, you probably need to wash your linens when you get up. Medieval belief held that it was more than a dream. It was an assault. Additionally, it's not your own imagination. No, incubi was responsible for that. Male demons that infiltrate your bedroom and become incredibly strange when you're asleep. Incubi were created for purposes other than enhancing mythology. They took their business very seriously. Particularly when attempting to explain involuntary sexual encounters, church leaders sincerely believed in them. It was far more easy and religious to blame a lusty demon than to acknowledge that you could be a little repressed if you had an aroused encounter when you were asleep. Though distorted, the reasoning was astute. If your body falters, something outside of you must be interfering with your soul's attempt to be pure. However, don't assume that the women were also safe. The female counterparts, succubi, were available to them. Demon matchmaking at its most eerie level, these sexy demons are said to entice sleeping men, gather their essence, and use it to procreate women in other beds. This entire cycle was a part of a greater story, even if it honestly seems like a terrible supernatural fanfic. Desire is perilous, the body is weak, and when all else fails, blame hell. Unbelievably, the church wasn't merely discussing this topic in private monastic gatherings. These concepts appeared in confessionals, sermons, and even court documents. It may be dismissed as a demonic encounter if a lady reported being raped while she was asleep and woke up with symptoms of the attack. A man was likewise demon-caused if he was consumed by guilt over his nighttime emissions. Exorcism rites were also practiced in some areas, especially for those who thought they had been the target of sexual demons. You weren't merely admitting your sin, you were looking for spiritual purification from real-life monsters in bed. This is where things become particularly complicated. These devilish justifications frequently have a social purpose. They provided a rationale for failure, particularly for celibate clergy. Imagine spending years imprisoned in a stew cell as a monk attempting to rid yourself of all material cravings. Then, one morning, you suddenly find yourself in a predicament. Lust is not to blame. There's no way you can hold Brother Thomas accountable in the following cell. However, a succubus is a card that can get you out of hell. Naturally, this also sparks a gloriously awkward argument among academics. Were these night demons truly believed in? Or did they serve as a psychological tool, a means of overcoming suppression and shame in a society that denied people the right to experience typical human emotions? Most likely, both. In addition to being steeped in supernatural belief, The medieval culture was extremely pragmatic. When necessary, people were able to identify innovative theological gaps. And if that meant blaming imaginary demons rather than addressing your own unfulfilled needs, then so be it. According to one bizarre little fringe notion, demons may become so fixated on a single individual that they would follow them about for years, constantly looking for weaknesses. Chronic guilt, recurring dreams, or even infertility may be explained by this. There is a documented instance of a nun who would not leave her alone because she thought a demon was her spouse. She apparently felt the creature's presence every night, even after fasting until she became unwell. She received more prayer in place of therapy. How did that turn out? You can guess. The situation was considerably more delicate for women. It made no difference whether a woman's fantasy about being seduced was true or not. It was believed that her innate inclination towards sin was demonstrated by the fact that she could even unintentionally conceive it. The female body in particular was viewed as an unlocked door that was constantly vulnerable to spiritual home invasion. You were obviously being attacked if you were pious and still felt desire. Well, you were inviting the devils in if you weren't pious. Here's the worst part, though. Sinners were not the only ones targeted by demonic desire. You might draw more unwelcome attention the more pious you were. In their writings, saints and mystics frequently described experiencing sexual visions, particularly while in prayer. These were not confessions made in private. Their official biographies occasionally mentioned them. For instance, when in the desert, Saint Anthony the Great is said to have been tormented by images of nude women summoned by the devil. According to the tale, Jesus was particularly vulnerable to temptation because of his holiness. This concept led to a paradox. Tormenting someone sexually wasn't merely a show of weakness. It might be a badge of honor, too. You were valuable enough to be assaulted if the lustful demons were attacking you. You were engaged in a spiritual conflict. Every dream, difficulty, and private embarrassment served as evidence that you were engaged in battle with hell itself. Theoretically, that sounds admirable, but then you understand that it also meant that your suffering was meant to be beneficial. Even if they wanted to, the typical medieval individual was unable to avoid these concepts. Your self-perception, body image, and even your dreams were influenced by the church. Furthermore, it's a negative thing if you have a high libido or creative imagination. This strange fear-based lens distorted everything you experienced. There could be no arousal without suspicion. No dream could be innocent. You didn't even know who you were fighting until it was over. And every night your bed turned into a possible battlefield. What do you do then? You pray more fervently. You make more admissions. To resist temptation, you may burn herbs, light candles, fast, flog yourself, or even sleep in your clothes. Since everyone else is acting like they're all right, silently freaking out, and wondering if that dream they had last night indicates they're being pursued by a demon or simply a human. You try not to think about it, and you definitely don't talk about it. In the end, it hardly matters, because, from the perspective of the medieval church, there is little distinction between your body and a battlefield. Suppose you have done everything correctly. You've kept your thoughts pure, for the most part, avoided sexual looks, and even attributed that one dream to a fleeting demon. You've kissed the relics, admitted your transgressions, and perhaps, just for peace of mind, lighted a candle or two. Maybe you're on God's good side, even though you're still anxious. You enter a church one day, look at a fresco by the altar, and then you wish you had never opened your eyes, because the repercussions of making a mistake are detailed in a medieval horror film. Pain, fire, and body parts, in places they most obviously don't belong in a writhing orgy. Greetings from medieval sin art, where pleasure is penalized and damnation becomes strangely detailed. You see, the church did more than simply explain the consequences of sin. They desired to show you. A 20-foot mural depicting individuals being flayed, burned, and mutilated for all eternity is the epitome of fearing God. However, The genuinely unique style of medieval religious art reserved a particularly imaginative kind of retribution for sexual transgressors. Artists did not hold back in telling you that lust was not only terrible, but also aesthetically disgusting. The lusty are frequently depicted alongside demons who specialize in degrading and disfiguring the human body in these paintings and carvings. Men's genitalia being eaten by huge rats, women's breasts being bitten by serpents. Souls impaled is a common motif. Indeed, there as well. It's hideous, intricate, and always quite personal, even when flames flare up around them in ornamental tiny swirls. No sin escaped punishment, and these scenes made sure you knew what damnation looked like, in case you had ever wondered. It wasn't simply forever. It had to do with your favorite era. The most notorious source of this art was Peter Damian, a priest who lived in the 12th century. He offered fire and brimstone on a silver platter in his books. He was particularly harsh on priests who failed to uphold their celibacy vows, comparing them to animals and claiming they would endure particular suffering in hell. This quickly caught on in the public mind. Soon, painters started adding these incredibly detailed tortures on church facades, manuscript margins, and stained glass. Medieval people were interested in it, let's face it. Although it didn't frighten everyone into piety, this stuff left a lasting impression. The Last Judgment is a well-known example that is frequently depicted above church entrances or on cathedral walls. Thus, it would be seen entering and exiting. On the right, sinners fall into chaotic hellscapes, while Christ sits in the center, calm and radiant. Can you guess which group is treated the worst? You got it. Those who are lustful. Their penalties are consistently the most gruesome, excruciating, and degrading. It makes a strong statement. For 5 minutes, desire may feel fantastic, but the costs will last a lifetime. Not in an ambiguous, abstract manner either. Pitchforks, toads in unimaginable locations, and flame-scorching areas of your body that you hoped God wasn't observing are all on the table. The Vision of Tundale, a fringe collection of works that resembled medieval, near-death experience fan fiction, included some of the most bizarre facts. In it, an angel leads a warrior through hell. He witnesses a pit where worms consume both men and women who have had extramarital sex. In a different portion, nude people are buckled off into scorching rivers by fiery horses. Tundale is appalled. The angel gives a shrug. They put pleasure ahead of morality. He claims, this is what they get. The book gained enormous popularity and was widely imitated in the medieval Sunday school manner throughout Europe. All of this may seem over the top, even dramatic to you, but that's kind of the purpose. Religion in the Middle Ages was not sophisticated. They were aware that terror was effective. Even if you were incapable of reading Latin, interpreting the Bible, or debating religion, you might still recognize that the man with the snake in his butt most likely did something incorrectly. You can virtually feel the fear just by gazing at the walls. It's fear via images, fear through flames, and fear through pain. Naturally, this art was not created in a vacuum. It was frequently combined with sermons meant to stoke your worry. Each punishment's meaning was explained in terrifying detail by preachers while pointing to the artwork. One may claim that this woman opened her body before to marriage. Her body is now permanently open. Yes, it is graphic, but it is also unforgettable. A sort of spiritual echo chamber was produced as a result. The dangers of lust were not the only thing you heard. You were repeatedly witnessing it, not only at places of worship, popular culture, stories, mystery plays, and even bar humor were influenced by these pictures. It was always the same message. Hell is waiting with open jaws, and sex is a trap. The situation becomes more complex at this point. Some contemporary academics contend that the purpose of these horrifying pictures was more than mere terror. They were also a kind of grotesque catharsis, a kind of therapy. The sins were visible to you. You witnessed the results. You could digest your remorse and, ideally, turn from your sins after being shocked and appalled. According to this perspective, the artwork was more than just moral propaganda. It tasted harsh, but it was spiritual medication. Others, however, resist. These pictures, they believe, went too far, that they established a society in which people were always terrified of themselves, where you could burn for all eternity just by thinking the wrong thing. Additionally, terror loses its effectiveness if it functions too well. It paralyzes you, and you cease developing, reaching, and living when your faith paralyzes you. Nevertheless, these images had a function in the medieval worldview. They maintained social order in communities. They served as a reminder that even when you were by yourself, people were watching you, that you weren't the only owner of your body. It posed a spiritual risk. And any church artist with a good supply of red paint, including Brother Tundell, says that one mistake may put you in a ditch full of worms. What do you do then when you witness anything like that? When that pretty neighbor gestures at you, you probably walk a little more slowly, pray a little more fervently, and perhaps grip your robe more tightly, since you are now aware of the stakes. That hell, the one you can visualize, right down to the color of the flames and the expression of complete joy on a demon's face, not simply sin or hell. And those images stay in your mind once they're there. That's actually what makes it so brilliant. They accompany you to church, to bed, and to every temptation. You didn't have to go home with the church. It only needed to ensure that the artwork did. All right. You've come to terms with the possibility that demons may visit you while you sleep, that your dreams are most likely immoral, and that you will be publicly burned in some fresco somewhere if you even entertain a naughty notion. All right. However, if you're married and abiding by the laws, having sex is finally safe. Correct? False. Because the medieval church loves to remind you of this. Sex in a marriage could still be sinful. Take a moment to process that. You're doing it all correctly. Ceremony, vows, mutual consent, and trying to conceive. But if your intentions aren't sincere enough, you could still find yourself on the church's naughty list. You haven't been listening if that doesn't cause your eye to twitch. Once more, the idea that desire is essentially disordered is the source of this paranoia. Marriage is just a temporary fix. A spiritual duct tape fix. The blessing of marital sex was not celebrated by the church. Only because Augustine claimed that it was a necessary concession to human weakness did it hardly permit it. Marriage was there to contain your libido, which would run wild if left unrestrained. However, offense is not a good thing. It serves as a warning. Theoretically, only 3 circumstances permitted married sex. It had to be able to reproduce first. Dodging or blocking is not permitted. Secondly, it had to fall within the parameters of faithfulness and monogamy. All right. Third, and this is where the ambiguity arises, it has to be done without too much pleasure. Yes, exactly. Even with your own spouse, you are not permitted to have excessive desires. You are on the verge of sin if your main motivation was pleasure. You would better hit the confessional if you were a bit too satisfied after finishing. Let's dissect that. If your heart wasn't entirely in line with your divine destiny, you may be married and trying to conceive and yet be a sinner. And that mutual desire was questionable if both partners truly wanted each other. It wasn't pure. It was decadent. Additionally, indulging was a moral warning sign. This, of course, resulted in some really embarrassing circumstances. Medieval confessors were required to evaluate married couples' intentions. Something that sounds less like spiritual counseling and more like an invasive therapy session. Certain priests employed confessional manuals, such as penitentials, which provided comprehensive flow charts for categorizing sins. Some of the questions they asked were not uncommon. Did you have sex during a holy day? Did you do it too often? Did you enjoy it too much? Was your spouse menstruating? Was it Sunday? They were anticipated. The worst part was that no one could agree on how frequently was too frequently. According to several medieval texts, having sex more than once a week was excessive. Some were a little more giving, perhaps twice a week, but each manual was laden with guilt. You owed more penance for having sex more frequently. Priests would occasionally designate days for prayer or fasting according to how lustfully you had carried out your marital responsibilities. Not to mention the emotional cost. Even though you're making an effort to be faithful, every bodily act of love could get you into trouble with God. You had to mentally check yourself before you could even say, "I love you." Do I have too much love for them? Are they more important to me than God? With each kiss, is my marriage bringing me closer to holiness or closer to hell? Just some light-hearted questions to think about while folding the laundry, you know. Marital sex timing was also strictly regulated. There were entire sections of the calendar shut off. No sex on the eve of communion, on a saint's feast day, on Fridays, Sundays, or during Lent or Advent. Up to half the year could be eliminated, depending on where you lived and how closely you adhered to church doctrine. Furthermore, don't even consider the possibility that one of you was ill, on the road, or in a state of ritual impurity, a general word used to describe women. Surprise, surprise. The strange thing is that people manage to find love for one another in spite of everything. Despite having a cloud over their heads, they continue to laugh around, share beds, flirt, and have intimate moments. Each kiss posed a query. There was a hint of shame with every contact. You were concerned about more than sin. You were afraid of being noticed. A rumor could start if your neighbor heard too much laughter coming from your residence. Rumors also had a tendency of becoming a form of punishment. Not every religious leader was as stringent, of course. Priests and theologians who held that blissful married love was a part of God's plan were among the most forgiving voices. However, those opinions were frequently suppressed by harsher, louder voices. You appear to have greater authority the more rigorously you instruct. Fear spread more quickly than elegance. Furthermore, the more a speaker stressed damnation, the more pious he seemed. Here's a fun fact for you to know. Some monks think that having sex might allow demons to enter a marriage. Even in a legal situation, giving in to desire could make your spiritual defenses less strong. According to one Benedictine chronicler, the devil prowled around newlyweds' beds in an attempt to seize them in a moment of indulgence and brand their souls. Isn't it romantic? Sounds like a mood killer. The extent to which this was taught versus enforced is still up for dispute among academics today. Before getting busy, did the typical medieval couple actually look at the liturgical calendar? Most likely not. However, the worry was genuine. The guilt was genuine. More significantly, the concept of sin was ingrained so strongly that your conscience may be aware of it, even if no one else is. That's what makes it so brilliant. It was unnecessary for the church to pry into your bedroom. All it had to do was make sure you carried the shame with you. You'd do the work for them that way. You would absorb the criticism. You would question your own emotions. You would be happy with yourself. Here you are, devoted and married, yet you continue to tread carefully on spiritual issues. You make an effort to love your partner, but not too much. You make an effort to appreciate intimacy without going overboard with pleasure. Like a playlist you didn't request, you maintain the rules in your mind. Timing, aim, frequency, purity, and, worst of all, the possibility that you won't even realize you've made a mistake. It's possible to go to bed believing that you're simply being a decent partner and wake up feeling as though you've unintentionally offended God. Because love did not absolve one of guilt in the Middle Ages. At times, it's simply the most beautiful cage. Right now, you're juggling piety, guilt, desire, and a revolving calendar of spiritual landmines while navigating life like a tightrope walker without a net. You've come to terms with the fact that having sex is risky, even in marriage. However, you're smacked with another medieval surprise just when you believe you've figured out the church's maze of sexual do's and don'ts. Sex is not always frowned upon during certain seasons of the year. It is strictly prohibited by religion, not by legislation. Greetings from the sacred minefield of abstinence from flesh. Yes, that covers the bed as well as the dinner plate. This is how it operates. You live in a time when the calendar is set by the church. Not just saints' days and feast days, but whole seasons devoted to spirituality. For instance, the 40 days before Easter are known as Lent. The 4 weeks leading up to Christmas are known as Advent. Both are periods of repentance and self-control. The regulations also get more stringent during those weeks. No meat is allowed. Drinking alcohol is discouraged. Tone down the music, laughter, and joy, and definitely not sex. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter if you're married, discreet, or claim that you're doing it to conceive. You move quickly, and your body is part of that. However, it doesn't end there. All throughout the year, Fridays were regarded as penitential days. Sundays were too sacred for indulgence in the body. Then there are quarterly ember days. 3-day fasts, the nights before important feast days. No sexual relations. Christmas's 12 days sent conflicting messages. Definitely not on the eve of communion. All told, about half of the medieval calendar was deemed unsuitable for sexual conduct. Imagine that you are attempting to monitor this. You're worn out from your job. You want to enjoy a little warmth with your husband. The weather is cold, and your children are permitted. But hold on, look at the calendar. Is it Lent? Is there a saint's feast tomorrow? Is Wednesday here? Are you in the cleansing phase after giving birth? Did your partner attend confession? What phase is the moon in? You begin to question whether a nice time will ever come. Even worse, the church moralized sex during these times rather than simply outlawing it. You weren't simply enjoying a prohibited pleasure if you disobeyed the regulation. A holy period was being defiled by you. An old proverb states that a person's sins double during Lent. According to medieval confessors, periods of supposed cleanliness were when spiritual focus was most susceptible. It was considered spitting in the face of God's grace to give in even little. Discipline wasn't the only factor here. It has to do with control. The church was training you to live your entire life in accordance with its authority, including how you eat, sleep, and have sex. People took the calendar seriously because they couldn't trust you to control your body on your own. There have been accounts of couples crying as they confessed to giving in to temptation during a fast. Some made up for it by going on pilgrimages. Others fasted from meals entirely, wore sackcloth, walked barefoot, or engaged in public penance. After all, what's better than abstaining from sexual activity? Abstaining from everything. And don't believe that this simply applies to ordinary people. Royals and nobility were supposed to set the example. One case of a queen receiving reprimands for being pregnant during Lent is documented. The church required royal heirs, but that didn't matter. The fact that she had violated the holy calendar was more worrying. You were not exempt because of your status. In actuality, it increased your visibility and, thus, your level of criticism. Given that Lent was the church's most successful sexual limitation campaign, let's focus on it. Giving up meat and sugar was only one aspect of Lent. It had to do with cleansing, a total depletion of the body. Christ fasted in the wilderness. Priests reminded their flocks. It was your turn now. The least you could do was wear your trousers till Easter if Christ could forgo food, water, and comfort. Furthermore, sex, even married sex, was viewed by the church as an excessive indulgence. Then there's the intriguing analogy between flesh and meat. In Latin, flesh, caro, meant both meat and the body. Therefore, abstaining from flesh has two meanings. To discipline your stomach, you gave up meat. To discipline your spirit, you gave up sex. Aligning your will with God's was the key. The church wanted you to experience desire, which is a form of hunger, but not to sate it. Here's a fun fact about the fringe. The question of whether breaking sexual fasts rendered other religious observances illegitimate was indeed a topic of discussion among theologians. For example, did your entire fast reset if you had sex on a Lenten Friday? Was your prayer still accepted? Did you start it, or was it worse that you liked it? These were not hypothetical inquiries. Monks wrote in-depth analyses on them. Whether your nocturnal frolic took place before or after the rooster crowed could determine whether you live forever. The ideal was rarely met in actual life, of course. People made mistakes. Some people completely disregarded the regulations, particularly in rural areas with little church supervision. Others merely wished for leniency from their confessor. Priests have been known to roll their eyes and perform simple penance. 3 Hail Marys and a stern warning to act appropriately. However, the guilt persisted. You carried the worry whether you were punished or not. You can bet that the gender politics also surfaced. Desire was typically thought to be sparked by men. Therefore, the husband claimed that the offense was his if the wife refused to have sex during a prohibited time. However, it was viewed as particularly shocking, even abnormal, if a woman started it. Her desire was viewed as a threat, something out of the ordinary, and a violation of nature. Therefore, even if the rules were the same for both sexes, the burden of shame wasn't always shared equally. Here's where the irony lies. Sex became more potent as a result of all this attempt to regulate it during holy times. It increased the allure of sexual closeness by transforming it into forbidden fruit. People made up stories about things they couldn't do, like a twisted version of Advent calendars. Couples made extremely careful and discreet jokes about Easter countdowns. Additionally, the body whispered yes more than the church did. You are now living inside a clock that is ticking away from pleasure and towards self-control. Your days are defined by the things you are not allowed to do, not by the things you look forward to. The calendar is a prison masquerading as a blessing, and the church has its hands on the dials of your desires. Nevertheless, love endures. The fissures allow desire to seep through. People whisper in chapels, sneak kisses in fields, and wait for permission to touch again. Because even the most basic pleasures seem miraculous in a society this constrained. In the medieval society, Mary is the untouchable emblem of holiness and purity that you should aspire to admire. Mary, the Virgin, the Mother of God, the lady who somehow gave birth while being pursued, radiant with purity and untarnished by the slightest smudge of sin. Not your neighbor Mary with the noisy hens. Mary was the church's shining image of what a woman should be, fertile, but never lusty, nurturing but never sensuous, a womb without desire, during a period when the church was fixated on controlling sexuality. The perfect woman is one who has never had sex and has no desire to do so. Welcome to the age of the virgin cult. The adoration of Mary exploded like incense smoke in a crowded cathedral starting in the 12th century. She transcends the role of a biblical character. She turns into a norm, the norm. Her statues proliferate. They write hymns. Cathedrals are built in her honor, and miracle tales proliferate like ivy. She is more than merely Christ's mother. She is everyone's spiritual mother, and not like Eve, who got intrigued after hearing a serpent and ruining everything. By accepting God and placing her body under sacred lockdown, Mary saves humanity. Let's be honest now. Here, the biology is, well, amazing. Jesus is conceived by Mary without having sex. Prior to, during, and following childbirth, she maintains her virginity. Don't inquire how. It is regarded as a mystery, and you are not permitted to ponder it. Actually, according to Catholic belief, she was physically unaffected by Christ's birth, like light through glass. It is physical, not only metaphorical purity, and that concept gains momentum. Mary is shown by artists wearing immaculate white robes. Unaffected by dirt or aging, lies, the official flower of virginity, are always present. She is frequently shown reclining serenely in a building like a cathedral. highlighting her function as the new ark, perfect, sealed, and holy. Her face is calm and detached. She hardly ever glances at the audience. Despite never being earthy, she is maternal. The only reason she has a body is to refuse it. All medieval notions of female virtue are anchored by this purity. Mary is frequently and overtly cited as a role model for women, which seems okay until you consider the consequences. It is expected of you as a medieval woman to exhibit her qualities, which include silence, modesty, obedience, and, of course, chastity. You will never be Mary, though. By default, you are a fallen daughter of Eve. Trying to mimic her and feeling awful when you don't succeed is your best option. In the meantime, the Church creates a cosmic contrast between Mary and Eve. Sin came into the world through Eve. Salvation enters it through Mary. Eve gave in to temptation. Mary agrees to obey. Paradise is broken by Eve's desire. It is restored by Mary's denial. It's similar to a theological two-woman performance, only that one is praised and the other is blamed for eternity. And you're caught in the middle, constantly reminded that your body may tilt in either direction. Here's an oddball aside. The possibility that Mary could have experienced sexual desire and only resisted it was disputed by certain medieval theologians. Others maintain that she was so pure that she had never even considered the idea of lust. The question of whether she had intercourse or not was a contentious religious issue. She didn't, everyone agreed. But did she have to resist the temptation like the rest of us? No, according to the kinder version of the tale. It goes without saying that her inherent tendency towards purity made her even more difficult to bond to. This is the point at which the virgin worship shifts its focus from Mary to social control. Real women are shaped and shamed by her appearance. Wives are instructed in sermons to act like Mary. Girls are taught to value their virginity above all else, not only for God, but also for their families. The honor of a family is frequently closely associated with the purity of a daughter. Even being forced to give up your virginity outside of marriage can sometimes wreck your future. Your virtue, which included abstaining from sex, was what determined your value. Mary's influence takes on a different form at the convents. Nuns are referred to as Christ's brides, and their chaste vows are based on her unending virginity. Some people describe spiritual marriages with divine grooms who never touch in love letters to Jesus. Mary is their mother, their queen, and their insurmountable objective. Women who entirely abstain from flesh are the most holy, not only in fact, but also in desire. Longing is a natural human emotion. It is divine to suppress it. However, Mary's light does not provide solace to everyone. Among women who don't fit the mold in particular, there is a silent but growing discontent. For instance, widows frequently occupy an odd liminal space. They are required to refrain from getting married again and showing interest in men, even though they are no longer virgins. Despite what their bodies tell them, they are urged to live like Mary. Young ladies struggle to choose between living up to an ideal that requires emotional distance and satisfying their husbands. Icons of a woman who gave birth without ever knowing a man are all around us, even pregnant ladies who are obviously engaging in the messy process of sex. It produces a tension that cannot be overcome. Artists, too, struggled with this dilemma at times. Mary appears painfully distant in several images, more deity than lady. Others show small slivers of realism, a hand on her bloated stomach, a hint of fatigue, or a moment of intimacy with the baby Christ. However, those are the exceptions. Perfection continues to be the prevailing paradigm. She embodies what all women should be and what no woman can do. Not only women were impacted by this unattainable ideal, this perspective on women was also imparted to men. A lady who behaved like Mary, modest, quiet, tidy, and submissive, was considered virtuous. A woman was Eve, a seductress, dangerous and lustful if she didn't live up to that expectation. There was no intermediate ground. It was either virgin or hard. This dichotomy influenced expectations, relationships, and even the law. Women who were accused of sexual misbehavior were evaluated based on their ability to uphold Mary's reputation as well as their actions. Did they avoid male company, speak softly, and dress modestly? Otherwise, any charge has greater weight. Because of your affiliation with Eve, you were culpable. Nevertheless, people continued to hold on to Mary in spite of all of this pressure. She served as their comfort, their intercessor, and the only person they could confide in who could relate to their vulnerability. Mary becomes more human in certain traditional cultures. Even if she appears in dreams, weeps with peasants, and blesses childbirth, she remains a virgin, pure and just beyond of grasp. You now live in a society where the ideal woman is someone who never had sex and never desired to, yet who went on to become the most significant mother in history. You attempt to emulate her. You sing to her. You pray to her. And you're reminded that your body is not the blueprint every time you experience desire, fall in love, or just wish you could be yourself for 5 minutes. Hers is undamaged, and hers is. You're attempting to worship a virgin who somehow gave birth to the Savior without ever ruffling her robes. Confess your immoral thoughts. Stay away from the occasional succubus and obey the regulations. But you're itching for something deep down. Is having sex really so dangerous for your spiritual health? Furthermore, marriage does not completely protect you from sin. Is the one genuinely secure path simply not taking it? And presto, the medieval church has been subtly implying that very thing all along, because celibacy was exalted and marriage was accepted. The true VIPs of salvation were those who completely stopped having sex. Greetings from the realm of holy aesthetics, monks and nuns. A passage from Matthew's Gospel opens the eunuchs for heaven. Jesus states, "There are those who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven." This is most likely a metaphor, but in medieval Europe, metaphors had a way of becoming reality. It wasn't simply about not having sex. It was to deny the idea of sexuality. Those who completely abstained from the body were the most pious Christians. No getting married, no touching, and no nighttime mishaps. Only sons, poverty, obedience, and prayer. Because they rejected the flesh, which bound everyone else to sin, monks and nuns were viewed as the spiritual elite, not because they were inherently smarter or more holy. Christ was their spouse, and like any good medieval marriage, they had high standards. Any physical reaction was to be controlled, any desire squashed. There was more to the ideal monk or nun than celibacy. Like robed angels, they were disembodied. However, getting to this position required more than just closing a door and putting on a hood. Because you chose to be holy, the body, being the obstinate creature that it is, doesn't simply cease wanting things. Because of this, monastic life in the Middle Ages was characterized by a constant onslaught of physical and spiritual disciplines. Praying at strange hours, fasting, isolating oneself, and occasionally flagging oneself to control one's libido. Indeed, individuals whipped themselves to stifle desire as well as punishment since, by the logic of the time, pain was a powerful tool for stifling pleasure. Others went even farther. There are well-documented, albeit rather fringe, tales of men who castrated themselves out of affection. Instead of succumbing to amorous desires, one monk, Saint Pelagius of Cordova, was said to have ripped his own body to pieces. To quell his cravings, another, Saint Benedict, hurled himself into a thorn bush. Extreme, of course. However, these tales were inherited as sources of motivation. These were not scary stories. They were examples of success. Stories of men and women who had humiliated the flesh and risen above it, who had tamed the beast inside. And this wasn't limited to men. Convent women were frequently held to the same, if not more stringent, standards. Nuns lived in dormitories with rigid curfews, shaved their heads, and wore rough gowns. No perfume, no mirrors, and only hymns may be sung. Some cultures may even forbid embracing. Desire, especially emotional desire, was suspicious even amid sadness. Physical virginity was not the only objective. It was total disengagement. What's fascinating is how this manifested itself in society. In addition to their sympathy, people admired monks and nuns for their alleged abstinence from temptation. Armed with prayer beads and an unwavering contempt for physical cravings, they were viewed as spiritual warriors engaged in daily combat with the devil himself. If a family had a child at a monastery, they would brag about it. For the privilege of having a son or daughter abandon the world, some would give money or land. It was more than a simple sacrifice. The flex was social. Yes, there was a lot of religious writing that romanticized this, in case you were wondering. Prayers, hymns, and hagiographies, basically Saint Fan fiction, describe innocent souls who are souses of the Lamb, white lilies among thorns, and impervious to corruption. My favorite is the last one. It was believed that monks and nuns were Christ's spiritual bride and groom. Their union was marked by vows of self-denial and silence rather than wine and dance. It's similar to a wedding, but nobody is ever allowed to touch anyone. Here's the twist, though. Monastic societies weren't quite scandal-free, despite their stellar reputation. For example, there are many spiritual contradictions in historical documents. There were nuns who gave birth in secret, monks who sneaked out at night, and entire convents that were closed due to allegations of sexual behavior. And the public went crazy whenever one of these stories surfaced, because everyone secretly understood how difficult it was to turn off the body. You can put up a wall of stone, but your mind is not very obedient. That is the fundamental paradox of the entire system. The human body didn't agree with the Church's elevation of chastity as the pinnacle of virtue. Then fear came back. What chance did the rest of us have if the selected ones, monks and nuns, could still make mistakes? Not all of their failures became scandals. They served as reminders that desire was pervasive, sneaky, and nearly uncontrollable. This leads us to one of the most frank discussions among contemporary academics. Was power or sanctity the true purpose of celibacy? The Church took power by urging individuals to give up inheritance, family, and land. A monk who was completely committed to the institution had neither a wife nor children. A nun in a cloister was safe because she was isolated from the outside world. Some contend that sanctity had nothing to do with promoting celibacy. It has to do with maintaining the Church as the focal point of your life. Just you and your soul, in the care of the clergy and owned by God, with no heirs or diversions. Naturally, this was not how the typical medieval person saw it. They truly held monks and nuns in high regard, and a large number of people who went into the cloisters did so sincerely. Some discovered joy, some purpose, and some serenity. However, the same precarious foundation served as the basis for the system in which they lived. Even in the mind, that sex was dangerous. That yearning was an illness, even if it was never fulfilled. And that not playing was the only way to win. Now, as a common sinner, you pass a monastery and experience the pain of inadequacy. These folks have sacrificed everything. As you try to sneak kisses behind the barn, they pray. While you're debating whether it's a fast day or a feast day, they're sleeping on straw. They belong to the elite. You're only a human. And despite your best efforts to stay faithful, your desire keeps pulling you back down. Perhaps love is too messy, you begin to think. Perhaps the body is a curse after all. Perhaps salvation is reserved for people who have completely lost their feelings. Imagine that you are now a traveler. You enter a new church to worship after traveling to a different hamlet, either for business or a pilgrimage. It's calm and quiet at first. Sunlight flickers over the wooden pews and slants through stained glass windows. But then you notice an odd sight painted on the wall as you look up past the altar and the hanging incense burners. A nude person encircled by fire and chained. Something is pulled from between their legs by a snarling demon. Around their hips, a serpent coils while another person cries. There are bodies in pain everywhere you turn. Their penalties are horribly particular. It's not merely a general hell, the damnation of its anatomy. Welcome to the anatomy lecture on the doctrine of hell, the most graphic classroom in the medieval church. You see, the church's assertion that sexual transgression resulted in punishment was insufficient. They had to explain to you how it was, where your sins would cause you pain, and why. Every aspect of the body was a target in these realistic hellscapes, particularly the areas you had previously been taught to fear. Eyes, breasts, mouths, and genitalia were all subject to retribution. The demons used it against you if you sinned with it. Justice was more than a poem. It was uncomfortably personal, vivid, and unflinching. Nor were these representations tucked away in chapel back corners. They were frequently spread across enormous wooden panels behind the altar, high on the walls, carved into columns, or in the center of the room. The most well-known example, the forerunner of the Last Judgment fresco in the Sistine Chapel, and innumerable others that were influenced by it. Christ divides souls while sitting serenely in the middle. The blessed soar aloft in flowing garments on one side. Conversely, some of the damned are eaten, flayed, or speared in the very places they misused during their lives as they plummet into pits of fire. The message was very obvious. Both hell and your body remember what you did. Consider the teachings Gris Deus engraved on the tympanum of a French church from the 12th century. Monstrous animals are shown devouring him groin first, their eyes wide with fear. Why? Since he gave in to his desires. Subtlety was not important to the artist. The entire sculpture actually functions as a warning label. Make no effort to have fun, and it was successful. People were frightened into obedience, or at the very least silence, by these visions. And it wasn't just paint and stone. In addition, the anatomical horror show featured manuscripts, those meticulously hand-copied books brimming with divine wisdom and gold leaf. Drawings of men chained to torture wheels with clear symbolism involving their lower half, ladies being pursued by hybrid monsters, and demons fondling sinners can be seen in the margins of supposedly sacred literature. It resembled a medieval meme format, except instead of humor, there was spiritual doom and genital mutilation. Why so specific? Because dread requires details. It is simpler to disregard a threat that is more threatening. Showing someone their own anatomy twisted and burned for all eternity, however, makes every decision suddenly important. The church desired for your conscience to be plagued, not merely aroused. The next time your thoughts strayed towards temptation, you were to keep these pictures in mind. When you were by yourself, the art turned into a second skin that clung to your imagination and flashed behind your eyes. The almost compulsive symmetry of sin and retribution is what heightens the intensity. Did your eyes commit a sin? Your eyes have been removed. Your tongue is ripped or burned with your mouth. They're nailed or flayed with your hands. Furthermore, the genitalia were nearly always the target of punishment for sexual sins, which include lust, adultery, fornication, masturbation, and even excessive marital desire. Some suffered insect or animal stings, while others were cooked or stabbed. A line of souls heading towards hell, each being punished according to their precise sin, is depicted in a whole illustrated text. It reads like a nasty anatomy teacher's spiritual horror show. Naturally, how literal these visuals were intended to be is up for contention among academics. Some contend that they served as symbolic visual representations of inner anguish. Some claim that the church meant for them to be interpreted as literal sneak peeks. To be honest, these pictures were accurate for the typical medieval individual who was illiterate in Latin and had never seen a medical textbook. Art was not visible to them. They noticed cautions. Furthermore, the stakes were significantly higher for women. The anatomy of women was viewed with particular skepticism. It was believed that women's bodies were more susceptible to corruption, more brittle, and more defenseless. In some representations of hell, women are burned where males sin, pierced through their wombs or dragged by their breasts. Even being attractive was risky. One could hold a beautiful woman accountable for other people's transgressions. She was occasionally portrayed as equally responsible if she mistakenly or purposely lured a male. The church weaponized anatomy in this way, making your physical appearance a possible curse. However, the grotesqueness was not limited to texts and murals. It also permeated preaching. Preachers would stand in front of frightened crowds and describe these penalties in graphic detail, frequently creating the tableau gradually as the screams reverberated into space and the flesh burned and teeth gnashed. They would always bring it home with them. You might be this person. Not today, perhaps. Not next year, perhaps. However, your body becomes your permanent prison if you die in sin. This is a spooky side fact. Priests were instructed by some penitential texts on how to explain hell to children. Yes, kids. The objective was to sow the seeds early and instill terror in the young. The fires of hell, according to one handbook, are like a hot iron taken from the hearth. Another suggested warning boys that they would be devoured by serpents that would emerge from their loins if they touched themselves. Little Thomas, have a sweet dream. Let's not act as though this didn't work. These pictures became ingrained in the culture. They appeared in folk tales, popular melodies, and even jokes. To see churches with particularly striking scenes of the Last Judgment, pilgrims would travel great distances. They served as behavioral tools for parents. The devil will cook your tongue if you don't eat your veggies. This may sound ridiculous now, but this was your moral universe in a world without alternative narratives, therapy, or the internet. You may easily roll your eyes at this point. To consider it excessive scaring tactics. However, it was catastrophic and extremely successful, because you never feel really safe once you think that your own body is a sinful ticking time bomb. Not in your own flesh, not in prayer, nor in bed. There was no need for the church to create additional penalties. It only needed to persuade you that your body would turn on you. And that conviction only grew stronger each time you gazed at those walls, those fires, those snarling demon faces. You now have the picture of hell within you, regardless of whether you are a lifetime villager or a traveling merchant. Every time you look too long, you see it. Every time desire awakens, you sense it. In addition to the fact that it is right, you attempt to resist because, in your mind, a clawed hand is ready to punish the exact aspect of you that betrayed your soul. Fire has been at your back all your life. Figurative fire, whenever your ambitions flame up, and real fire in the case of those dreadful murals. You've listened to the guidelines, saw the penalties etched in stone, and endured enough admissions to commit the script to memory. However, the sermons arrive just when you believe the church has used up all of its fear-mongering strategies. Prolonged, boisterous, and dramatic shows that are meant to frighten you rather than educate. Greetings from the hallowed theater of doomsday dirty talk, where your body is constantly on the line and every Sunday is Judgment Day. Let us establish the scenario. On a Sunday morning, you find yourself at your village's parish church, crammed in next to everyone else. The air is saturated with the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and sweat from nervousness. It's hardly a sermon at all when the priest approaches the pulpit, possibly barefoot and yelling Latin words you don't understand. It's a monologue on apocalyptic horror. Gentle knowledge does not exist here. No gentle prodding. It's a verbal abuse. And you're sitting in the target's pew, wide-eyed. The fashion. Imagine medieval comedies. If all the jokes were about hellfire. These sermons were meticulously graphic, theatrical, and performative. Preachers warned you about more than just lust. They thoroughly explained what it would be like to be punished for it. The devils who would exploit your own sinful body as a means of torture, the worms that ignore your genitalia, and the eternal flame that licks the sensitive insides of your thighs. It resembled a live, customized horror audiobook. This was particularly prevalent during Lent and Advent. Reflection and guilt were ramped up throughout the two penitential seasons. In the days preceding Easter, it was not uncommon for priests to preach about fire and brimstone every single day. One message was hammered home for entire weeks. Your soul is on the verge of collapse due to your aspirations. Berthold of Regensburg, a German preacher from the 13th century who traveled around cities and villages like a traveling doomsday machine, is considered one of the all-time greats, by which we mean absolutely awful. The intensity of his preaching was renowned. To emphasize how terrible your eternity would be if you didn't reveal every last sexual idea, he would pace, make wildly erratic gestures, yell, cry, and occasionally even fall theatrically to the ground. People adored him. They sobbed, passed out, and resented in large numbers. The enthusiasm of a medieval TED lecture, but with more brimstone. Furthermore, there was no safe area. Not even your ideas were forbidden. It was a common warning from preachers that contemplating sex was as damning as actually having it. Naturally, the ideas could appear at any time, during meals, mass, or other sermons. Even as you listen to someone explain your guilt, you could still be guilty. That is a moral conundrum that is meant to confine you. And it was successful. People have been known to pass out during sermons in bouts of fright, certain they were immediately heading to hell. During the sermon, some attempted to confess. Others begged for forgiveness by crawling down the church aisle on their knees. According to one version, a guy sobbed while listening to a lecture about passion, fled into the street, and joined a monastery the same day. Whatever you want to say about schooling based on fear,